How is everybody doing today? Welcome back to another episode of the Banker Next Door. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Berquist. Today, I wanted to bring everybody a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who did a study last year in May of 2024 on basically how could you possibly get rid of the quote-unquote stigma that is related to the Federal Reserve's discount window. Now, I did an episode last year, episode 216, which I put a link to in the description down below, where I basically discussed the discount window, how banks get access to the discount window, what it is, how it works. So if you want a little bit more information on the discount window itself, go check out that episode. I also discuss a little bit more in depth why the stigma, quote unquote, is around the discount window. But today I wanted to focus more on this report here from the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So this is the report itself, which there was also a link in the description down below to this report here as well. So again, this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This was published in May of 2024, and it's titled, "Can the Discount Window Stigma Be Cured? An Experimental Investigation." Now I'm just going to read two things to you guys here. We're going to read the abstract, and then we're going to skirt down to the conclusion. Now, what they tried to do here in this experiment was a senator had basically come up with this idea to say, if we force banks to basically utilize the discount window just a little bit every year, so that way they're constantly basically every year they're borrowing from the discount window and paying it back. If we basically force this utilization, would that then be able to remove the quote unquote stigma that was associated with using that line of credit from the Federal Reserve? Now, real quick with the stigma thing. The reason why that exists is because the Fed is considered the lender of last resort, and it's a line of credit from the Fed. And just quite simply, if it's just known kind of in the banking world, banking circles, banking industry, if you will, that if your bank is going and borrowing from that discount window, you must be in dire straits. You must be in big trouble, and that's usually a giant red flag. And then again, if you're publicly traded, your stock is probably going to see a big decline as analysts and everybody else jump all over the bank and say, well, what's going on over here? Why are they borrowing from the discount window? And thus, that's why the stigma exists. Now, that's a very simple explanation for it. It gets a little deeper than that, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. Okay, so let's take a look at this abstract here real quick. So a core responsibility of a central bank is to ensure financial stability by acting as the lender of last resort through its discount window. The discount window, however, has not been effective because its usage is stigmatized. In this paper, we study experimentally how such stigma can be cured. We find that once a discount window facility is stigmatized, removing the stigma is difficult, and I would add, if not impossible. The result is consistent with the Federal Reserve's experiences, which have been unsuccessful at removing the stigma associated with its discount window. So that's kind of setting the stage there. So, and I'll just read this quote. So this came from Senator Mark Warner, who basically proposed this in December of 2023. Why should not we have maybe some kind of random basis, a mandatory use of the discount window so that we can start erasing that stigma? I am going to put forward legislation that would require some usage and how we do that on an episodic basis. So that was kind of how the genesis of how this whole thing started. So now this whole report's 37 pages. I'm going to go down here to about page 23. You got, as normal with a report like this, you got, 10 pages of sources and references at the end. But let's read through the conclusion here for a second. So DW stigma, discount window, in other words, DW stigma is a major challenge to central bank lenders of last resort responsibilities. You know what? I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to blow this up here for a minute so that everybody can get a better view of this. So, okay. After the 2023 banking turmoil, U.S. regulators proposed various forms to remove stigma at the Fed's discount window, including a mandate for banks to borrow at the DW regularly. This proposal finds partial support in A&H, who found that required random borrowing can prevent the formation of stigma when a new, i.e., not yet stigmatized DW facility is introduced. In this paper, we tested experimentally whether two interventions, random borrowing and a free DW, can cure the stigma attached to an already stigmatized DW. Our results show that both types of interventions significantly promote DW borrowing. However, we find no evidence that they cure the DW stigma fully. In particular, in the last rounds of our random borrowing, respectively high random borrowing treatment, the proportion of banks that borrow at the DW do not exceed 1/2, respectively 2/3, and the borrowing trend is flat in the last rounds of the experiment. Similarly, setting the cost of the DW to zero, an extreme scenario under which DW borrowing is not only the equilibrium, but it is also a dominant strategy, also fails to cure the stigma fully. An econometric analysis reveals that once the DW becomes stigmatized, inertia sets in and subjects' behavior becomes less responsive to the feedback they receive. These results, combined with the results in AH, suggest that required random borrowing can be considered a preventive, but not a curative intervention to treat DW stigma. Our results are reminiscent of the long literature on coordination failure in games with Periota ranked equilibria, such as the weakest link or stag hunt game. Various interventions have been shown to improve coordination in these games, but they typically fail to help behavior converge fully to the first best equilibrium. Further, using a within subject design similar to ours, Brantz and Cooper find the impact of these coordination-inducing interventions to be weaker when subjects first experience an extensive period of coordination failure. This is consistent with our findings that required random borrowing is less effective when subjects first experience a stigmatized DW. Our results also echo the Fed's experience. Over the years, DW policies have been modified on multiple occasions with the explicit objective of promoting DW borrowing and mitigating stigma. To this day, none of these reforms seem to have been satisfactory. Our results suggest that indeed curing pre-existing DW stigma is difficult. In particular, we find that the latest reform proposed mandating regular DW borrowing is unlikely to be effective. In fact, finding that even extreme interventions, such as making the DW free, may not be sufficient to fully cure stigma, raises the question of whether there is any hope of removing the stigma already attached to the Fed's DW. DW stigma has clearly become deeply ingrained among practitioners, and it may be impossible. What did I say at the beginning? Maybe impossible to change that norm. Two approaches could be envisioned instead. First, the new, i.e., not stigmatized, temporary emergency facilities could be introduced when liquidity markets become severely strained. These temporary facilities could be designed specifically to address the source of the problem at hand. This is, in essence, what the Fed has done in recent years when it introduced the term auction facility at the onset of the global financial crisis in December 2007, or the Bank Term Funding Program in March of 2023. This approach, however, may not be fully satisfactory. Indeed, although such temporary facilities could fix nascent liquidity crises, they would not prevent them. Only a permanent facility like the DW could do so. This leads us to the second approach. So second, instead of trying to fix the DW, new permanent backstop facilities could be designed to be stigma-proof. One possible example is the standing repo facility introduced by the Fed in 2021, where primary dealers and banks can obtain overnight liquidity. This facility was designed specifically to mitigate stigma concerns. In particular, it accepts only high-quality collateral, and its rate is determined competitively by auction. Although it has been little used, interest in the facility as a possible complement to the DW has grown in the aftermath of the 2023 banking turmoil. In fact, our results suggest that if the Fed intends to protect the standing repo facility against the formation of stigma, it should consider required random borrowing for this facility, not for the DW. So very interesting report there at the end. Again, I could kind of appreciate new things being attempted. Like, in other words, they investigated this and basically said, hey, what can we do here if we try to basically force banks to borrow from the discount window, can we effectively find a way to get rid of that stigma? Again, I don't think so, just because that stigma has been there for so long and it's so ingrained. And that was basically what the results bared out. However, I do think they did find a couple of really good suggestions at the end. I think that, for example, the bank term funding program in March of 2023, I think that actually worked really well. And I think it did exactly what they wanted it to do. So I would look to things like that in the future to basically say, yeah, if something comes up, hey, offer them a temporary credit thing, let them get the money they need real quick and let them go in there. The second thing, the standing repo facility, that may work and it may not work. I think a lot of that depends on the size of the bank. I think, it might work better for bigger banks than it does for smaller, community banks, but we'll see. Time will tell. But hopefully there will be more investigations like this and more reports where we could kind of examine some of these things and see, what works and what doesn't work at the end of the day. But I thought this was a very interesting report that the Fed put out. I'd been meaning to cover this for a while, but just didn't have a chance to get to it. So, like I said, just wanted to bring that to everybody today. But with that, I will wrap up by basically saying, if you like this episode, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, as that always helps the channel. Please leave your comments down below, as I always love getting back to everybody. Remember, there are links down below for both this report and episode 216, which is a more in-depth discussion on the discount window. Remember, we are on YouTube, Rumble, and all major podcast platforms. And as always, please make sure to check out some of the other content on the channel. Hope everybody has a great day out there, and I'll see you again real soon. Thanks a lot.